In the last part of this chapter, we're going to talk about two things: cultural barriers and differences, and then models in which we as marketers, from a conceptual standpoint, can look at cultural differences and how people are influenced by their culture, and vice versa. So to start off, cultural differences, there are basically three cultural barriers or differences that I want to go through here. First one is language and communication, another one is religion, and another one is value and attitude. So let's start first with language and communication. And so a critical element in international sports marketing is understanding language and how you can communicate with other people. Language is a common trait among every group. That language, however, may differ from culture to culture. You may have dialects within one language between different cultural groups, and that dialect may say something completely different about that cultural group than it does from another dialect of the same language. And so it oftentimes differentiates cultures from one another. For example, not everybody is Mexican. Hopefully you know. I'm sure you know that. That's why it's known as Hispanics or Latin American. Those are the terms that are used. Hispanic includes many different cultures. Also, to speak Spanish doesn't mean that you're from Spain. It may mean that you are from Mexico, or you may be from another Latin American country that speaks Spanish, and there are different dialects between those cultures. And understand, I remember this when I was in high school. I had 1 year, it was probably freshman year, I had a Spanish teacher who was from South Texas, who had more of a Mexican dialect in speaking Spanish. And the next year I had, my sophomore year, a transfer teacher from Spain who came to the United States and was taught Spanish for a year in my class. The two dialects were so completely different. I struggled so much in understanding the different from one semester or 1 year to another in the Spanish class. That's just one language. Obviously, the cultures are a lot different, and you can see that throughout the history of a lot of things. So moving on in language and communication, language is also oftentimes a vehicle for globalization. I'll give you an example. I have some really good, what I consider family in Germany. They're friends. Technically, they're not really family. The father of this family is a pilot for Lufthansa, which, if you ever heard of, is an airline that is based out of Germany. Another daughter is also a pilot for Lufthansa, and a third daughter, or second daughter, he's got three daughters. The second daughter is a pilot for German Wings, which is essentially a Southwest Airlines type of airline in Germany. She is also dating a pilot who is flying for Air Swiss. The whole point is this family is a bunch of pilots. They fly and they speak German as well as English, but they fly all over Europe, and all over Europe there are different languages. And the dad and one of the sisters fly over the world. Asia, United States, South America, Africa, all over. But the one thing that's universal is that no matter where they fly, for the most part, they speak English. You may be flying in Europe, yet all of the pilots are typically speaking English. They sometimes use other forms of that. The point is not that English is the best language in the world. What I am saying is that language is often a vehicle for globalization, and as you can see, the English influence on aviation in the history of the world is the reason why many people speak English with air traffic controllers and between airplanes as they fly all over the world. And so the point is that marketing messages oftentimes need to be framed with an understanding of language and communication. So without language being spoken, we may actually have issues. One thing is how we translate languages. You have to be very careful, especially if you're working from one culture to another with different dialects. For example, Coca-Cola, which is also known as Coca-Cola, which in China was what was originally thought of being used, is translated female horse stuffed with wax. It was changed to Coca-Cola, which is known as happiness in the mouth. Something very different meaning, but something that is important to understand when we talk about translations. Okay. All right, the second thing I want to talk about cultural barrier is that of religion. The foundation of most cultures in our world are based on religious reasons. And to be honest, a lot of the wars as well as actions of why people move from country to country and culture to culture are because of religious beliefs. And so it is the foundation of much culture. And as we've talked about earlier in the semester, it is the foundation of many sports organizations and sporting activities. And so one thing that we have to understand, something as simple as scheduling games, often conflicted when we talk about religion. And so holidays are often associated with different cultures, and those holidays may cause problems with religious calendars. So for example, look at the video I posted. I want you to watch that. It's about a lawsuit that came with TAPS, which is the Texas Association of Private and Parochial Schools, and a Jewish school wanting to play basketball. And so I want you to watch that video. That's a good example of just scheduling issues when it comes to religion. You may also have verbal and nonverbal gestures, so simple shaking of hands and introductions can make and break business relationships in different cultures, and the religious beliefs between those cultures can be affecting those introductions. The order, for example, who speaks first in a relationship, who orders or eats first during a meal is different between cultures, and many times that's founded in the religious principles of that culture. So looking at the religious reasons and participation, for example, a friend who was over in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and other Middle Eastern countries have different beliefs when it comes to females. They are very separate. Many times they're equal in some, but they're very separate. So when you enter into a new culture, it's important to do research on the religions within that region. Know who you're doing business with before you do business and interact with them. Because it can be the simplest things that, if you don't do your research ahead of time, that may make or break a business relationship or the framing of a marketing message. The third thing, or the third barrier, The third barrier that I want to mention is that of values and attitudes. It's another core trait of culture. Examples of how these different values and attitudes may be found in culture in general. The United States, for the most part, being on time is an important thing. That's why many times you have professors that are mad when you walk into class late. It's a common U.S. value, attitude towards timeliness. In Germany, for example, yawning is considered an insult if you don't cover your mouth. I took a group of students that kept yawning because they were tired, because they traveled from across the globe, and many times I had to remind them that cultural differences of yawning in other countries in general is important to understand. These values and attitudes are different. In France, politeness is very much expected. The title "Just Do It" by Nike is considered to be a command and may not be viewed as being as polite. Female participation in the Middle East. Eye contact is important for Latino, Indian, and Pakistani cultures. It's a sign of anger or subordination in Africa and East Asian countries. So again, understand the values and attitudes, the religious beliefs, as well as the language and the communication, and do research on your culture before entering into that relationships with them. The last thing I want to talk about is how do we understand cultures, or how can we, from a conceptual standpoint, view culture from different models. There's two models I want to talk about. The first one is the four-dimensional model of cultural differences, and the second one is the multi-level model of culture. First one, again, is the four-dimensional model of cultural differences. This model suggests that an individual culture is greatly influenced by their native country's societal values. There are four aspects that impact one's position in a cultural group, and I want to go through these four aspects on the next couple slides. The first one is the power distance. Power distance is the smaller the distance between the common citizen and their leader, the more independent the citizens are. So in other words, smaller distance between, again, the common citizen, the average everyday person, and their leader, the more independent the citizen is. The larger distance, the less likely they'll be seen or talked to the leader within that country, the more authoritarian that culture would be. In other words, the more likely you have a voice with your politicians, the more likely you are independent in nature. If a citizen doesn't have much right to talk to a political figure, then they would be seen as being a more authoritarian leader. So, for example, in the United States, we have small power distance in that we are independent citizens and have the ability to talk to our leaders. And China, on the other hand, has a larger distance between power and their everyday citizens, and therefore is seen as being more of an authoritarian type of leadership. How does this impact us in sports on and off the field? Well, look at something as simple as player and coach relationships, the control of information in the internet, how athletes are able to use social media in the United States as opposed to across the globe, have to do with the ability of power, those that are in power, and the voice the average everyday citizen has or consumer has. Second thing to look at in this four-dimensional model of culture is individualism and collectivism. Essentially, societies view individual achievements in comparison to their views on being members of a group. So in other words, Americans who prefer performance rewards based on individual merits, not necessarily based on group merits. How many times have you gotten extra credit and said, you know what, I'd rather just do this individually, or I'd rather be graded on and do this project by myself because I don't trust other people. I know what I can do, and I'm individualistic. We see that in American culture in a lot of respects. Again, it's not always the case, but we see that this is an example of an individualistic culture, as opposed to a collective culture where you're looking at the group. Seeing this examples in sports, participation and spectatorships are based on the virtues of the game. An individualistic sport may be viewed in individualistic cultures more often than those of a collective sport or team sports. So how would this change marketing messages across the globe? Well, as marketers, we have to highlight those dimensions that most closely tie to the culture in which we're trying to market to. So for individualistic culture, if our sport matches well with the individualistic actions of that culture or the collectivism nature of that culture, that's what we have to do as marketers. The third aspect to this model, is the uncertainty avoidance. It's basically the extent to which its peoples avoid or embrace situations of anxiety. So if I am trying to avoid, the extent to which people avoid or embrace situations of anxiety, if a high level of uncertain avoidance, then I'm active, aggressive, emotional, and compulsive. Yet a culture that would be seen as having low uncertainty avoidance are less aggressive, unemotional, relaxed, and not so prone to quarrels with one another. That affects how we impact or market to those people. The fourth and final dimension of this model is that of masculinity versus femininity. Gender roles oftentimes impact a culture and its perception of sports participation. Look at the United States as an example. You can see the definition of gender is starting to be discussed or questioned, and the ability of a male versus a female and feminine versus masculine is starting to come into question in our culture. Feminine values traditionally have been about relationships and quality of life, yet masculine values would be those about competitive assertiveness, materialism, and power. Now, the disclaimer to all of this is that these are cultures worldwide and not necessarily just the United States or just an individual person. But another way to look at this four-dimensional model of cultural differences. Another way as marketers that we can look at a culture is this multi-level model of culture, where you've got a top-down versus a bottom-up understanding. The most important key to this model and understanding it is that understanding the influence consumer has on their own broader culture as well as how their culture influences them. So global culture from a top-down perspective influences national cultures, which influence organizational cultures and groups and individuals, and therefore self-representation of culture. In other words, it's a top-down approach. Our overall global society believes X, Y, and Z, and therefore influences every culture below that. Generally accepted universal principles could be included in this. Okay? Murder is typically considered bad, right? That is a top-down approach. This is just an example. A bottom-up approach would be that an individual would then influence the groups around them. So a self-representation of culture would influence the group, which would influence the organization, the nation, and therefore the globe. So again, a cultural model of multi-level has a two-way approach.